I actually get the printed newspaper every day, 2 or 3 of them, and sort of see where is religion in there. And I make note of, how are they reporting it, or how are they looking at religion as it relates to world peace, or any number of other things. But now I pay attention to the climate and environmental work that is reported on in our daily newspapers. And today, just today, flooding in Haiti, how to get rid of your old electronics, fires and smoke coming from Alberta to our own now here in New York, and also last week in Colorado. Young adults who are voting more and more, particularly because of issues around climate change. And then all of the insurance for Allstate was stopped for homeowners in California due to climate risks. There's much more, but that's just what I got on the train this morning. So the issue is out there, and people are becoming so aware of that. So I'm grateful that you are here in this season to continue the work that you are doing all the time. And I just want to close with a prayer. I said prayer from St. Francis, but it's really a prayer from Francis, the Pope. Perhaps there is a sainthood in his future, I'm not sure. But in any case, I invite you to a moment of silence and remembering these words from Pope Francis. Fill us with peace, that we may live together with one another in harmony, with all creation, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in our lives and in creation. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not destruction. Help us to create a world where all of creation flourishes and thrives. May it be so. Thank you again for being here and for all that you are doing. I'm not sure who's next.
Is this on?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kusumita Peterson, and I'm a trustee and a founding member of the Climate Action Task Force of the Parliament of the World's Religions. And I'm not supposed to be here right now. But if you've organized enough programs, you have to, as you know, you have to have you have to be ready for anything. So we had asked Imam Safet Katovic to moderate this first part of the program, but he's coming from New Jersey. So I'm sure he will be here, but we can't be sure just when these things happen. So it devolves on me to moderate for the time being, and it's my great honor to do so. And first, I just want to thank you all for being here, and also to thank those who are online, because you're all key members of civil society, faith-based and interfaith groups that are involved in engaging the environmental crisis. The triple crisis, as it's called, of the climate emergency, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. So we're very grateful and honored to have as our opening speaker, Professor Daniel McGraw. He is one of the leading authorities in the world today on the right to a healthy environment. He certainly advocated for it, its legal recognition and recognition by the UN system, which happened last summer, for 10, 15 years. He's currently a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And he is one of the co-founders and was president and chief executive officer for about 10 years of the Center for International Environmental Law, or CIEL, and which has played a very key role in advocacy for the right to a healthy environment. And he has held many other distinguished positions. And there is on the table as you enter the very detailed bios of all of our presenters today. So without further ado, we want to hear from Professor McGraw and his opening keynote address. Dan?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me apologize in advance. A different kind of technical glitch has occurred. That is, I can't hear out of my right ear. So I will remedy that when I go back to Washington, D.C. But if I speak too loudly or do anything else that's untoward, just tell me because of this hearing. The last couple of years have seen some developments that are really, really promising in terms of dealing with environment and human rights. And they're promising. We need to follow up on them. That's a major message. And I will get back to that at the very end. But what I'd like to do is first just lay a little groundwork and then talk about the developments and what they mean. As background, and probably you all know this, over the last couple decades, we've realized that nature is the real infrastructure of our society. That's empirically, that's come through the development of the idea of ecosystem services, which is what nature provides humankind for free. Fuel, fiber, water, protection by the ozone layer from ultraviolet radiation, water power, opportunities for spiritual, recreational, aesthetic experiences in nature. Intuitively, I think we know that anyway, but empirically now there's no real question about it. Unfortunately, that infrastructure is in dire peril right now. And you've all heard of the triple environmental crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss and toxification of the planet, but it goes beyond that. There's water scarcity in many, many parts of the world that affects people. There's deforestation, antimicrobial resistance. Apparently about 5 million people a year are dying now because the medicines they're given don't work anymore. Overfishing in the oceans. The situation is really very perilous. And we really need to recognize that. So turning to the optimistic side of this, what are the developments that have occurred? Well, the main one is the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which, as Susmita says, occurred last July by the UN General Assembly. I want to give a little history on that. She said, I've been working on this for 15 years. I wish that were the case. My first it's actually chapter in the book was in 1985, I think. I've not been very effective in my advocacy, but others, of course, have played absolutely critical roles. And that's one of the messages of this, is that this is a global effort, and which is fitting because the problems we're facing are, of course, global. There are a few things that I just mentioned as highlights, and I'm going to mention my name a lot, or the personal pronoun, but a lot of people have been involved. It just so happens that I was fortunate to be involved in some of these. But a big step occurred in 2005 when the Inuit brought a case in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against the United States, alleging that climate change was violating their human rights, which is absolutely obvious if you look at the facts. The Arctic is warming at 2 to 4 times the rate of the rest of the world. It's endangering their rights to life, to property, to health, in many, many ways. When that was first announced, my wife, who's a well-known international lawyer, was at a meeting and people actually laughed at it. Now, you're familiar with this pattern, right? First, they laugh at you, and then they get angry. They say, well, you're just trying to screw stuff up. And they say, well, we knew that. We knew that all the time, so what, right? By now, no one doubts that climate change and human rights are related. But at that point, that was the whole point of the case, really, was to put a human face on climate change. And it succeeded in that sense. The case did not go forward, which is what we expected, to resolution, but it did change the paradigm in that sense. A couple of years after that, the Maldives, which is a set of about 1,200 islands off the southwest coast of India and Sri Lanka, organized a conference in Malé, their capital, and the small island developing states issued the Malé Declaration on the human dimension of climate change, which is the first international agreement. Well, it's not legally binding, but on climate change and human rights. And I'll come back to the content of that, but that was another step in this process that was important. And then we worked very hard, even in before 2007, to try to get the Human Rights Council to appoint a special rapporteur on climate change. Then we pivoted to special rapporteur on human rights and environment. That we succeeded in 2012. The first person, John Knox, did a brilliant job for 6 years articulating the relationship between human rights and environment. He issued framework principles on that relationship, and he called for the General Assembly to consider the right to a healthy environment. His successor, who is another brilliant professor, David Boyd, a Canadian, followed up on that work and tried to articulate exactly what the right to a healthy environment would be. Now, there was the campaign to get the right recognized took a couple different, well, it lasted decades, obviously, but it also had different phases. And there was a real push before the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, considered this in October of 2021. And I want to give some of the details because we need to do the same sort of thing now. And this was organized. Some of the people are in this room here who were instrumental in this, but there was a petition by over 100,000 children from around the world. There was a different petition by over 1,350 non-governmental organizations, which included some religious groups, by the way, importantly. There was a petition by over 50 companies, industries supporting it. The American Bar Association, that hotbed of radicalism, recognized the right to a healthy environment, as did the New York City Bar. And the New York City Bar played an important role in this, by the way, not just in that, but also in providing pro bono assistance to John Knox. Well, this is another way civil society can participate. There were over 15 parts of, excuse me, not over, there were 15 parts of the UN system that signed a petition, which included the World Health Organization, UNEP, of course, UN Development Program, which, as you know, is a powerhouse within the UN system, saying, yeah, there's this right. And that all occurred before the Human Rights Council voted in October. There was a lot, that was kind of wholesale work putting public pressure. There was also detailed retail work within governments, trying to get them to support it, trying to get them to move forward and that sort of thing. Many people were involved, and often it depended on who knew whom in a particular government. So the number of people involved in this was astounding, and it was very selfless, I should just say. Often in these campaigns, you get people trying to grab the mic. That didn't happen here. Everybody was going for this. The vote in the Human Rights Council was also very, very strong, 63-0 to 4. 4, unfortunately, included some pretty important countries: China, India, Russia, and Japan. The US was opposed, very actively opposed, but President Trump had withdrawn us from the Human Rights Council, so we did not have a vote. So I think Yogi Berra called that the right mistake. I don't know, or that sort of thing. In any event, then our focus was on the General Assembly. And at this point, it was more retail. It was working with specific governments, including the US government, to get it to shift its position, which it ultimately did. And the final vote was 161 in favor, 0 opposed, 8 abstentions. Notably, the US voted in favor, India voted in favor, Japan voted in favor. So we were able to shift some of these votes. But that's the most overwhelming endorsement of a human right in the history of the General Assembly. Even the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights 75 years ago did not get that kind of endorsement. So it was, the people that worked on this did a fabulous job, and so it's they're to be applauded. Now, what does the right to a healthy environment mean? There are two ways of looking at it. One is a functional way, and that's how the Male Declaration that I mentioned earlier defined it. It's in terms that humans have the right to an environment that's capable of supporting society and the full enjoyment of human rights. So it's functional. That's what we're trying to do. David Boyd, in his work, identified 6 particular elements of that. Clean air, everyone has the right to clean air, safe and sufficient water, a healthy and sustainably produced food, and notice the sustainably produced part of that, non-toxic environment to play, to work, to live, to study, to worship, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and a safe climate. So, and then, of course, there are the normal panoply of other human rights: the right to freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, to participate, privacy. All of those come along and support those. So we know what it means, actually. One of the arguments, well, you don't know, what does it mean, a right to a healthy environment? We know that, I think. But why is it important, right? Now, the most obvious thing is, well, we all need a healthy environment for our health, for our dignity, for our children's and grandchildren's health, et cetera. So that part, I think, is pretty obvious, but it's actually much more subtle and nuanced than that. In getting the United States to turn around, we focused on environmental justice. You say, well, why is this relevant to environmental justice? So the US EPA defines environmental justice in terms of no disproportionate burden on any disadvantaged part of society, and equal opportunity to participate. Even back in '92, I tried to get it to include, I was in the government then, I tried to get it to include, well, equal access to environmental amenities like clean drinking water, sanitation, parks, that sort of thing. That's never been adopted in the US government, but people are thinking that way. But none of those, that's not enough. Those 3 things, you could have equal, but if the environment's still killing you, you don't get justice. If it's still making you unhealthy. So the right to a healthy environment is actually the excuse me, fundamental assumption of environmental justice. And people have recognized that now, I think, over the last year or year and a half. And that's been a very important development, but it's critical to having environmental justice in any country is a healthy environment. It's also very important if we think about the rights of future generations. Now, you probably all know that many people think we have to think about the future generations. Indigenous peoples are particularly good at this, but others also care about that. But then there are especially intellectuals who argue, well, we don't know what they need. 125 years ago, we fought wars over salt. Now we're fighting wars over oil. We don't know what people will need in 100 years. But in fact, we do know they'll need a healthy environment, right? This one's easy. And it's so important that it really counters that and several other arguments, I should say, that are put up against the idea that future generations have rights. And the beauty of it, besides the intellectual one I just mentioned, is that it's seamless. But if we're trying to protect the environment now, and we keep doing that, then we adjust to changing conditions, to changing threats, to changing technology, and all those things along the way, so that 100 years from now, or I have a granddaughter who's 2 years old, she'll hopefully be alive in 80 years, right? You don't even have to think about future generations to worry about this. But if we keep doing that, it will be a seamless transition to a healthy environment in the future. So it's very important in that sense. The final sense I'd say is, and this is kind of paradoxical, but we're in real trouble right now, right? Part of the reason for that, a major part, is that we tend to view nature in utilitarian terms. How useful is it to us, to me? You've heard the argument, well, we need biodiversity because we might find medicines. I mean, that's true. But that begs the question, well, what about nature itself? And since we know that nature is the infrastructure of our society, and we know that what we've been doing so far has not worked, we need to change that balance. We have to think about nature as having value itself. Now, whether one puts that in terms of rights of nature or some other way of doing it, the point is we need to rebalance this. And the right to a healthy environment helps us do that if we listen to it. You say, well, how could that be? This is a human right. We have the right. That's true. But to give us the right, we have to have a healthy environment, not just one that helps us, but a healthy environment. So it's really, there's a lot of potential here. Just in closing, I want to go back to what we need to do. It's a beautiful idea. We've got it universally recognized now. Some countries, of course, continue to backslide on this, but we really need all of us to get involved in the kind of campaign that we had to get it recognized back in 2021 and now in 2022, I should say. That is, we need a sort of the wholesale, the public pressure kinds of things. We also need retail work. We need to work with people in governments and in NGOs. We need to get the right mention in as many international instruments as we can, so that people keep being reminded it exists, and the forces that want to push it down are, they're quelled to some degree. We need to put it in the monitoring systems. So the Human Rights Council, has the Universal Periodic Review. It looks at the human rights performance every couple of years of every country in the world. This has to be part of that. It has to be one of the rights that the Human Rights Council looks at. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, looks at environmental performance. We should get it every few years for all members of the OECD. These are just two examples, but we need to get it into the monitoring program so people are actually asking, well, is it happening? Is it being honored? And finally, we need to get it on the work programs. Now, the most obvious place to put it on the work programs is those 15 parts of the UN system that agreed, that signed the petition. And one of them, and this is, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, is the International Labor Organization. Now, I said there were two developments. First was the recognition of the right to a healthy environment. At the same time, and in a separate process, although some of the same people were involved, Marcos Oriana, for example, who's the special rapporteur on toxics, the International Labor Organization moved occupational health and safety, which is chemicals and chemical exposure and that sort of thing, up into their list of fundamental principles and rights at work. So they essentially said the right to a healthy environment at work, that's a right, which is just it's a sliver. It's an important part of the right to a healthy environment generally. But the ILO is now on board as well, very officially, and they did that again in 2022. So we need to get it on the work program. And let me just give an example of how that works. In 1996, the world community agreed to eliminate lead from gasoline. Now we've known that lead was a problem, right, since at least 200 BCE. Vitruvius wrote an essay about why it's a bad idea to use lead in water pipes. But of course, we keep using lead. But lead in gasoline is totally unnecessary. So we got this agreement in 1996 at Istanbul, and one of the other speakers, David Hales, was part of that delegation. And again, big civil society, I was in the government then, but big civil society involvement. David and I tried to get it on the work program of UNEP the next year, get it on the work program, right? Have it worked on, get them to start helping countries. And we couldn't do it. One of the countries blocked it. And this is a country that had already agreed to it, not only at Istanbul, but actually in 1994 in Miami with the Summit of the Americas. And the guy was so embarrassed, he actually showed me his instructions that he had to oppose this. And he knew it was wrong morally, but that he was doing his job. I've never had anyone show me their instructions from another government before. But we worked with that country. The next year, we got it on the work program. UNEP worked with the World Bank, and then it started in 2002, a public-private partnership, again, civil society, to do this. And in 2021, Algeria stopped selling leaded gas at the pump. That was the last country. So 25 years. But it got done. We don't have 25 years now. And the problems are much harder than just removing lead from gasoline. So I urge all of you to be involved. The religious communities are extremely important in this, and you have been important, and I urge you to continue to do that. Thank you.
Dan, go back to the podium for a moment. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes if you have specific pointed questions on, matters of fact or something an important detail that students we didn't hear. And I'm delighted that our Imam Sabit is here and will moderate the next session. So any questions for Professor Dan Brock?
And because you may have to translate, since I can't, not translate, but pass it on, since I'm disadvantaged here.
Anyone that was an incredibly wise and both wise and expert overview of the entire subject, history, and different aspects, including recommendations for our action in the future. Questions for Professor McGraw?
We'll have the roundtable later, so.
So after the next speakers.
If you can just go next to Dan, that way everyone can see you as well.
Right. Are there any questions for Professor Dan McGraw? If not, we'll go on to our next set of speakers. And I'll call upon Imam Sabit Al-Khatibik to come up and moderate this next session. Up to here. So the roundtable should start no later than 11.
Understood. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace, peace and blessings to all of you. Wonderful to see colleagues, friends, and shall I dare say, sisters and brothers in the human family, siblings in the human family. Wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We have a whole list of incredible speakers and presenters to shed light on this important topic for all of us. So what I will do is, I guess, call them up one by one. And it says 8 to 10 each, and I assume that means minutes. So we will be watching a clock because we do have a hard stop at 11 for the visioning roundtable. So reconciliation, justice, and creation care is the next subject on our agenda. And we're very, very blessed to have our dear sister here, Reverend Melanie Mullen, right here from the Episcopal Church. Travel mate and good troublemaker when we were in COP27 in Egypt. Good trouble is what we need to do, as the late Congressman John Lewis used to tell us. And I would also add, for those who don't remember, the second part of his statement was, if good trouble don't work, get in the way. She's not afraid to get in the way. You can read her bio here. God bless.
Thank you so much. It is just a joy that enlivens my heart to see you all here in this space, in this Episcopal space where we frequently hear words and think thoughts that I think in our tradition we aspire mightily to achieve. And that's an ongoing work for us. So for all of you esteemed colleagues, for our good trouble friends, I know that the Episcopal Church is trying. It's trying. I was definitely moved by Dr. McGraw's statement. Everybody understands the importance of this right. And I first like to center this thought in the fact that, well, you're giving us way too much credit. I find that in the Episcopal Church, we have developed a path towards reconciliation, creation, care that has to draw out the intent, the motivation, and the work and the methodology from Christians in the US that makes plain why everyone should know. And yet we're still working on that. For the very time that we've mentioned the idea of creation care, which is how we describe it in the Episcopal Church, we have to use words that help align people's understanding of why we engage in this work in the first place. Environmental or green or environment were words that pushed people away. They felt political, they alienated folks. And so we have to remind people again and again that the creation and our sense of solidarity with it and with each other is not new or radical or political. It is the essence of what we are. And yet it is an ongoing work. The idea that there's a place for people of faith in this work is still, I think, a little fresh to us. Even in the midst of the work that's been going on for, it was 15 years, even if 1985 was 15 years ago, I like that. It makes us feel young forever. There's still a freshness and a newness and an imperative to keep teaching this work. I think it's really important, and it was great that we could center in that vision of where environmental justice in the US first originated, with people of color, with minority faith communities, bringing to the fore this bridge issue. Way back in the 70s in rural North Carolina, there were preachers who went out and took parishioners to say that our experience of the environment demands attention and should be a human right. But I think for all Episcopalians especially, we are prone to believe in and adhere to the model of our drum major for justice, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., a model that now few of us would dispute, but who brought that bridge issue into our fore. His very last march in 1968 was with a union, an organized labor campaign, which I think is really important because labor was so imperative to push this idea of a human right to a healthy environment to the fore in the UN circles. And so I think it's very appropriate, although Americans can be very skittish to aligning with labor, especially faith-based ones. But in this march in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1968, it was the very last march that Dr. King participated in. Sanitation workers were marching for wages, but also this recognition of this holistic version of environmental rights. They were feeling sick. Their homes and their workplaces were being corrupted by environmental pollution. And although they didn't have the words for it, human right to healthy environment, they were living into this intersectionality that somehow those who were denied racial rights and justice rights were also being denied environmental rights. I think they moved instinctively into it. And I think we are blessed in both marks that at this end moment of Dr. King's ministry and career, we see that place where we are to pick up. And so for folks who are continuing that campaign work that Dr. McGraw said, the work of the campaign still goes on. The folks of the Poor People's Campaign, the folks of continuing environmental, anti-racist, and justice movements are still living into helping people understand that we all are a part of this intersectional right. That 1968 exemplary movement that helped people see the links between labor, social rights, racial rights, and environmental ethics is our ground zero for understanding how the way that we have denied all sorts of livability and human rights to the poor in this country and people of color in this country manifest in all of our lives. We see now, and we're better versed at understanding that low-income people, that minority communities and neighborhoods suffer disproportionate health impacts, that asthma and pulmonary disease are on pediatric cases more in poor neighborhoods than in others, that lack of air and land and water and clean food are those denied to those. And having just come from a pandemic where we all learned the phrase, was it frontline workers? Make sure we get out the way so they can come to work, but frontline communities. Once again, those communities of poor people, of people of color, those on the front line of environmental impacts are the ones who will draw our moral and ethical attention to the places where people are being denied the right to a healthy environment. So I think we lean on those exemplars, the faith exemplars, to help us see that we can take those steps, but you give us way too much credit. As faith people, we're still a little skittish. Can we get engaged in seeking human rights and also claiming environmental and creation care as the ground for faith people? And so I'm having to it made me want to go back into where do our own faith traditions draw the authority to do this work? Because we're refreshing it every day. This is not a side event or a side dish or a fringe ministry for folks who are engaged, especially the Christian tradition, but healthy environment and the right to an environment is core to how we understand who we are as God made us, if we believe in a God, as we do. But we're having to remind us again and again that for Christians especially, even the idea of a human rights was something that came out of our tradition. We don't like to own it. So I'm always reminding ourselves, and our colleagues over there, Linnea Main, are reminding us that if it weren't for people of faith, we wouldn't have this term at all, a human right. So we can comfortably live into it. Secondly, the idea of caring for the commons. Caring for the common good is one thing that the religious community has the right and the authority to do, because if we don't do it, no one else will. And just because caring for that right manifests in a political agenda, in the UN, in the state house, in the courthouse, is not a reason why people of faith don't have a right to be there. We're a little skittish sometimes, especially people of privilege and comfort, with the idea that once something moves into the public sphere, it has superseded religion. It is out of the hands of theology and faith. It's something for those secular folks. And yet I'm wanting to remind us again and again that what we see people of faith being called to do is to remember that we're made in God's image. And that image is one that doesn't just live spiritually or think about our hearts, but is one in which God's creation is meant for all. As we are told to say over and over again from our good trouble congressman, the late John Lewis, that we get into good trouble because the idea of God's divine created people means that they should enjoy. They should enjoy a healthy environment, that denying some is in itself what we might call a sin or a brokenness, a bad actor, but it is a wrong version of the world. I love thinking that some of our religious folks, when they wonder, should we talk about human rights because it's too hard? It's the same criticism we get when thinking about racial justice. It's too big, it's too hard. People will think that we're out of our lane, if you speak the slang. And yet, the idea that there's a gap between the way our human rights and our legal rights are conceived and the way they're lived should be great fodder for people of faith. I know in our Christian tradition, we had Desmond Tutu who said, it's that gap. It's the gap between realizing all of a sudden that there is something wrong that should inflame and ignite the people of faith. Not cower us down or make us feel like we should give up, but it's the realization. And so as people of faith and as clergy leaders and as lay leaders, when we think about what draws the average person in the pews, person on your kneeler, person on your prayer mat to practice their faith, it's making that vision of a godly world real. But that's a hard one. I'm speaking for all Anglicans here. We think about this perfect world. We think about Jesus. We think about the enlightened things of the world. And the gap is the place where we are called to act again and again. But it is very hard for us to do. And yet, here we can call upon that idea that if we proclaim and profess, as any Episcopalian would say, and you could probably get a bunch of them in the room to say, will you respect the dignity of all people? Yes, we will. We practice this. We know this, that the idea of human dignity is a human right. And therefore, the idea that dignified humans deserve clean air, clean water, access to food. And those things are a part of the core of a dignified and valued people. The common good, human rights, the social web of relationship. I think it's our work as religious people to help bridge linguistically the idea and realize that we're not put in silos, that the work of advocating for social rights, civil rights, and human rights are not other than but important to us. In our Christian tradition, we really believe in this idea of Jesus as an embodied version of God amongst us, the Emmanuel, but that body, that very bodied human nature is one when we think about Latin, they call it the Imago Dei, that there's a human person in God that needs clean water to survive, that needs clean air to breathe, that needs a healthy environment, that we aren't spiritual people that can go without this human dignity of environmental safety and sustainability. This Imago Dei is core to all of our bishops and preachers and imams and leaders, their idea that human beings deserve safe and healthy environments, that we can't live into a vision of hope and of a healthful future without it. So I think there is so much work to do, but the campaign aspect of teaching us to learn the language of human rights, teaching us to understand that environmentalism or creation care, if it's more acceptable to your populace, is one and the same. And also the fact that we have models in our religious leaders, in our Martin Luther King, and our saints, and our spiritual and political leaders that show us that there is more than performative allyship, that solidarity with those who are most suffering and left behind is a key aspect of our work. And we're great at it in some aspects. I love that our folks in the Episcopal tradition are taking our racial reconciliation course by the thousands, learning about how we bridge differences amongst identity, or language, or skin color. And now we are moving into the idea that solidarity with all the parts of God's creation is also important. We have folks who are clamoring for an idea that if we can value God's created earth and all of God's people in it, we can achieve that sort of balance, that justice that people are hungry for. But it is new. I love this idea of the functional ways we are learning to think about human rights. And solidarity is one. I think appealing to the passion that draws people of faith to UN COP summits, that draws people of faith to advocacy to Capitol Hill again and again, and letting them know that there is beyond more than just mere performative solidarity or social movements work, but the work of living into understanding that all of us, even the frontline communities, even those that are the least and without, deserve to understand that they have a right to a healthy environment. So we go beyond mere words, but into expressions. We go beyond advocacy that holds things apart, but living into solidarity. And we live into an idea that if the God created us to do the work of justice, God created us also to leave no one behind, to understand that a healthy environment is the right of all, and that we go forth loving, liberating, and going into the world, proclaiming that there is a human right for all of us in the life, in the world we believe in. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear sister, for the poignant reminders and just some good notes here, but I'm not going to go through all of them. We'll wait for the visioning session. But intersectional rights, I really appreciated your uplifting that, and that the continuing role and responsibility of faith communities to stand with the least of these. And a question often happens or that comes up is, so where does environmental justice take place? The answer is where the injustice is taking place. And the injustice obviously is a global phenomena, but it's a real life and death situation in such a literal way for what we call the vulnerable, most impacted communities. So we'd like to move on to our next speaker as we speak about impacted communities. And we have our dear brother, and once again, I'm going to refer you to for the details of the wonderful abbreviated resumes and wonderful collection of experiences and backgrounds and levels of service of our various speakers to the order, the bios that are contained in your handout. But our dear brother Jeffrey Roth from the Lakota community will be speaking with us, and like to make a recognition. I don't know if this was done before I came because I was a little bit late, of what was often said, land acknowledgement. And so we do recognize that we do stand upon the land of the Lenape peoples here in Manhattan, and that it was cared for. And all of those who are the inhabitants and residents of this land in a way in which there was harmony, justice, and recognition of the rights of all on this little part of Turtle Island in North America. So our brother Jeffrey Roth will kindly address us on the health of Indigenous people on the subject we have here. We're going to have him online. Is that correct?
Can you hear me?
Trust?
Can
We
you
can
hear
see you. Please take it away, my brother.
me? Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today, and I apologize for not being able to make it up there and be in person with you all. You know, as said, you know, I'm Lakota Sioux. My dad was born on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. The reservation is both in North Dakota and in South Dakota. I live in Washington, D.C., and in my regular job, I consult on health and other matters with tribes and urban Indian organizations in the United States and elsewhere. And then I also sit on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I just started my second term on the forum as an expert member. I'm also very honored today to be here amongst this panel. I'm very impressed so far, and I appreciate listening to what everybody's talking about. So I have some remarks here. I may be a little bit longer, but I'll cut some out. But I just wanted to kind of go over to make sure that I hit all the points that I wanted to talk about specifically. I wanted to talk about a member study that I presented this past April at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. In addition, I want to reflect a bit on the intersection of health, and environmental and biodiversity protection. The study that we did was an introduction and an effort to define indigenous determinants of health for the UN system, and also for member states of the United Nations and local indigenous peoples. During the opening session of this year's Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues on April 17th, the Secretary General came to our opening session, which was great. It was the first time in a while. And he said in his speech that the UN is committed to keep promoting the rights of indigenous peoples in policies and programs at all levels, and to amplifying indigenous voices. Let us learn from and embrace the experience of indigenous peoples worldwide and work hand in hand with them. So for 2 weeks during the Permanent Forum, we listened to indigenous communities from around the world express their concerns and needs. And for the first time this year, the forum devoted considerable time to focus on health and wellness as a response to this year's theme, which involved human health, planetary and territorial health, and climate change, specifically from a rights-based approach. This theme gave the forum, as the main international indigenous body, the opportunity to define and educate about indigenous determinants of health. My colleagues on the forum were kind enough to appoint me to produce a study elaborating on the topic. And then they welcomed the study titled Indigenous Determinants of Health in the 2030 Agenda, which is intended to act as a toolkit and guide for UN agencies and member states, including national, state, regional, and local governments, to understand how to appropriately work with indigenous populations in the implementation of any initiatives or policy impacting their health and wellness. The latter entails effective collaboration and ongoing involvement of our peoples in all projects. This work, is grounded in 20 years of the UN Permanent Forum work, and also on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was ratified by 144 countries in 2007. We gathered together for this study 20 indigenous experts from across 5 of the 7 sociocultural regions, and we worked to create a framework for global intervention for health. This global collaboration has been so impactful that the group members have decided to continue collaborating and we've named ourselves the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, and we plan on continuing this work. There are 3 main themes that we discuss in the study itself. And the first theme is specifically about intergenerational and holistic healing. The second section is on decolonizing and re-indigenizing culture as a determinant of health. And then our third section is specifically on the health of Mother Earth. And I just wanted to read a sentence or two from the beginning of that section. Quote, indigenous peoples and communities have been in a deep and meaningful relationship with their surroundings for as long as they have existed. They have formed systems of being, including thoughts, behaviors, and lifeways that have sustained us until disruption through the forces of colonization. It is worth mentioning that traditional practices from pre-colonial eras continue to exist. Earth-based practices, cultural practices, and belief systems continue to exist, although not universally, and to varying degrees in various indigenous communities. So I would actually really recommend that you look at the study and take a look at it. We'd really appreciate it. And we also appreciate any feedback on it. Again, the study was intended to create tangible outcomes for our indigenous peoples at the local level. Our goal was to ensure that everything that we did focuses on improving the health and wellness of our local indigenous peoples through these interrelated determinants of health, whether they be climate change, planetary and territorial health, mental health, maternal and child health, primary care, and more. So while this study has been created to educate non-Indigenous decision makers and policy advocates, we also aim for it to be used as a tool for local Indigenous leaders to advance their needs, initiate dialogues with local authorities, and to prevent the further minoritization of our Indigenous peoples globally, including the minoritization of our people's lifeways that are intrinsically linked to environmental health. While, Indigenous people make up 6% of the world's population, we care for and manage over 80% of the world's biodiversity. Because we are so linked to the environment, our health is also closely linked to environmental and planetary health. So minoritization in this context means that UN agencies, institutions, member states, and local governments approach Indigenous peoples with the same measures and methodologies as they do with minorities or other vulnerable groups. This is often in conflict with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but it also immediately hinders the ability of our communities to be prioritized, and it hinders the uniqueness of our concerns because it becomes co-opted by the discussions of minority needs, especially since our numbers are smaller in many countries. It creates invisibility of our peoples globally. Minoritization of Indigenous people is a major obstacle at all levels within the UN. We face this situation in other UN entities and mechanisms like the Biodiversity COP and others when they refer to Indigenous peoples and local communities. This label and concept diminishes our rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as it has the effect of minoritizing of our community's needs by grouping us with local communities, which is actually a pretty unclear term as it is. So the study with our recommendations was designed to create the dialogue on these types of issues that we face, and that in these types of issues that hinder our ability to be productive in our efforts to preserve the environment, biodiversity, reestablish our Indigenous ecosystems, and reestablish our Indigenous food systems, and in turn create healthier Indigenous peoples. To ease understanding and collaboration, we included a chart in this study that compares the WHO general social determinants of health with the corresponding Indigenous determinants of health for easier understanding. The Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance is planning on developing additional documents to ease with the operationalization of our study recommendations. And I'm honored to announce and tell everybody that the Permanent Forum has approved a second member study from us titled Improving the Health and Wellness of Indigenous Peoples Globally, Operationalizing the Indigenous Determinants of Health. And this will be presented next year at the 23rd session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York.
Very cool.
So in the current study on Indigenous determinants of health, one of the strongest suggestions that we make is that the WHO incorporate the concept of indigeneity as an overarching determinant of health in all of their work, policies, bodies of knowledge, and initiatives. As such, indigeneity will encompass all of the specific circumstances and recommendations that are included in our determinants of health study. Along with the publication of this study, the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance made a call to action during the Permanent Forum. We asked for help from member states to support a resolution that Brazil said they would be offering at the World Health Assembly. This resolution passed by consensus just last month in May in Geneva at the World Health Assembly. And I was able to be there. It was fantastic, and participate in some of the side events around it. This resolution is the first of its kind for the UN system, and it calls upon member states to approach and look at Indigenous people's health through the lens of social determinants of health. It requires the WHO to provide technical assistance to member states in these efforts. It creates a mandate for the WHO to work on improving Indigenous people's health for the first time in the history of the agency. We've never had a mandate specifically on Indigenous health. And therefore, the WHO has not done much in the past. It also calls on the WHO Director General to present a plan created in consultation with Indigenous peoples to improve the health of all Indigenous peoples globally. And this is to be presented at the 79th World Health Assembly, which is in 3 years. The WHO also needs to staff an office at the WHO to provide technical assistance to member states, and then to also propose strategic lines of action within the WHO to improve the health of Indigenous people. So in addition, our alliance called for the creation of a high-level Indigenous peoples consultative body to the WHO Deputy General, which would assist in the implementation of any of these mandates included in this Indigenous Health Resolution, as well as to advise and provide insight into the best approaches to find success in improving Indigenous people's health for other mandates within the WHO. So the Indigenous Determinants of Health study also called for, again, the adoption of indigeneity in the upcoming update to the Social Determinants of Health report. That update was supposed to be coming out this April. We're still waiting. The last we've heard, it's going to be coming out in September. And I will say that the WHO has been working with us to include this and to also include a summary of our report at the permanent forum. So we're excited to see that. We're also seeing that, the environmental and planetary health communities are starting to embrace the concept of Indigenous people's health and see the benefits of aligning themselves with it. In its first ever policy note last month, the Planetary Health Alliance did just that. From their policy note, quote, planetary health aligns with the Indigenous people's relational approach to nature and to health. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues expressed the centrality of nature like this. An interdependent relationship exists between Indigenous peoples and their local ecosystems. The health of the land and the peoples are synonymous, nurtured through relationships with the physical and social environments, providing a strong basis for health and overall well-being. The approach to health is further described as Indigenous peoples tend to approach health as an equilibrium of spirituality, traditional medicine, biodiversity, and the interconnectedness of all that exists. In line with this, an objective of the planetary health science is building a body of evidence documenting the interconnection between human health and the state of natural systems. The holistic framework for health articulated in the 2023 report on Indigenous Determinants of Health accurately reflects planetary health science that shows human health cannot continue to flourish while the natural life support systems we depend upon continue to decline. We align with this report and framework and advocate for its broad integration into practices of the World Health Organization and all other health-related agencies and into the post-SDG framework. We call on the planetary health community to draw on the work of the UN Permanent Forum and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and expand recognition of Indigenous peoples and their roles in policies on both health and on the environment. So, my primary reflection, and my ask, I think, I always like to have an ask for individuals and institutions that wish to be supportive in this work, which many do. is to continue to advocate and support for the rights of Indigenous peoples, and more importantly, the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in what I like to call the room where it happens. I'm a Broadway fan, so, you know. This includes across all mechanisms of the UN system. You know, all too often we're excluded from the decision-making or high-level conversations at the global level. And when you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Here, there are many reasons why we're not at the table. And I just briefly want to talk about, you know, including one of the big reasons that I've run into with the WHO is a lack of academic education. I have a bachelor's degree, and the WHO it really wants to make sure that anybody who presents at any of their sessions has a PhD or an MD. That's been a difficulty in accessing and participating in advisory committees. There's a lack of staff or organizational support across Indigenous peoples. The Permanent Forum staff or secretariat does not have the capacity or mandate to support interventions beyond the Permanent Forum. Quite often, Indigenous peoples become the victim of political negotiations with hostile entities. You know, all too often, the voice of one member state ensures no participation of Indigenous peoples will occur, and we need leadership here. And oftentimes, there's lack of funding for travel, for staff, for organization and representation. You know, I sit on the stakeholders advisory group that oversees the World Food Summit coalitions from a stakeholder perspective. You know, and unfortunately, I'm the only one that sits on that advisory board that isn't working for a trade organization or some other paid position that is supporting their participation on that with staff and with resources. Quite often, Indigenous people are in this situation where we don't have the support needed to effectively participate in these global dialogues and high-level participation. So we must continue this fight for the future of all of us. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I want to thank you all for including us. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that wonderful, insightful presentation, an informative presentation. Our dear brother, Jeffrey Roth. I think it can be, amongst this audience and amongst others, to be able to say that a right to a healthy environment, a barometer for that right, will be the interdependent relations that have been championed by the Indigenous peoples, and the health and the well-being of both the ecosystems and the food systems should be that barometer. So thank you for your presentation. We'll have questions and answers probably during the visioning session, because we have a wonderful set of speakers today. And the last one that I'm responsible to introduce and facilitate his presentation is our dear brother, David Hales. For the sake of transparency, I do serve with him on the Climate Action Task Force of the Parliament of the World's Religions. Consider him to be an older brother. Once again, the details of his resume are available to you in summary form, and his various accomplishments. And he will be addressing us on, make sure I have it right, learning from the future, not the past. Brother David.
Thank you, Sapit. It is great to see you, and my deep gratitude to the speakers who have gone before. Your inspiration and your wisdom is inspiring, and I'm deeply touched by your presentations. I'm going to talk today about the issue of intergenerational rights and equity. And I'm going to start with some fairly simple propositions. Let's start with the one that all humans have rights. What these rights entail is still evolving. And there are some who will argue that rights also exist for transhumans, those who are not human. But as the simplest of propositions, let's start with the fact that all humans have rights. If all humans have rights, then those humans who will follow us in future generations have those same rights. And we should act to protect that right to make the choices that matter to them. The third proposition is that the stakes are very high. The number of future individuals whose lives matter could be vast, and the challenges that we face are also vast. We have an opportunity, fourth proposition, to affect how the future unfolds. It is in our choice whether these individuals will have the opportunity to flourish, the opportunity to exercise their own agency, their own human dignity, whether they will suffer, or whether their rights will be infringed. The fifth proposition is that the opportunity to make a difference is equal to the responsibility to make a difference. And the final simple proposition is that the choice we make is ultimately a moral choice. It's not economics, it's not politics, it is a moral choice. So let's focus on how high the stakes are. If we're mammals, mammals on average, each species lasts about 1 million years from emergence as a species to extinction. If you look at us humans as a species, we're 200 to 300,000 years into our expected lifespan. So let's consider a scenario where the world population stabilizes at, let's say 10 billion people based on UN projections. Let's assume that all of these people who will live after us will have a lifespan of only 50 years. If we live out our expected lifespan as a species, that'll be about 50 trillion people over the next 700,000 to 800,000 years. Now that's mind-boggling, and it's kind of useless to think about it that way. But it does give a sense for where we fit in this entire process. So let's focus on the next 2 generations downstream from where we are. The majority of those who will be born in the 21st century will live in the 22nd century. Some of our grandchildren now, not great-grandchildren, not future generations, our actual grandchildren will see the 23rd century. We are at the same time a species which has assumed power of geological proportions. And we are shaping this future for those who will follow us, primarily with our poisons and our waste. There are other aspects of it which we can employ as we shape that future, but just ask yourself now whether we have any right now, this generation, those of us who live now, to not take seriously just how big the future could be and how high the stakes are in the decisions that we make and the influences that we have on it. It's interesting to think of this as we are, for most of those people who will live on this planet, barring some catastrophe that takes the human race out of existence prematurely, we're the ancients. We're the people who will live in what will be the distant past for most of those who follow us. What we do now will affect untold numbers of future people, and we need to act wisely. The idea that future people count is common sense. Future people are people. They will exist. They will have hopes and joys. They will sing and pray. They will dance and laugh. They will suffer. They will feel pain. And they will have regrets just like the rest of us. They just don't exist yet. Does focusing on those people, however, imply that we must sacrifice the present on this altar of posterity? No more than caring about our children doesn't mean that we ignore the interests of strangers. No more than caring about our parents means that we can't care about our children. Every year, as Dan talked about earlier, millions of people, literally millions of people, disproportionately in poor countries, die prematurely because of fossil fuel burning and the pollution that and particulate matter that we put into the air, lung cancer, heart disease. The impacts are real and measurable. The same holds for preventing pandemics. The same holds for controlling artificial intelligence. And the same holds for addressing and decreasing the risk of nuclear war. There is remarkable overlap between the best ways we can promote the common good for people living right now and for people who are living in the future. The point is that even if we only consider the impacts of these risks on the present generation, and we only consider the potential loss of lives, not economic impacts, not sadness, not loss of dignity, just loss of lives, the issues that we face are among the most pressing of our time. If you consider the impact on future generations, then they become even more critical to focus on. Nothing will become less expensive to address in the future. Nothing that we face now will become politically easier for us to address in the future, and nothing will become morally easier. So the reduction of existential risks is one of the most important tasks of our time. We have seen this with the COVID pandemic, which is very real to me today. And the reason I am not there with you in person, which I deeply regret. Dan and I had planned to have dinner last night and he was paying, so I deeply regret it. But this illustrates a more general point. By reducing the risk of catastrophes which endanger the future, the pandemics, for example, we reduce the risk of smaller disasters which face us today and tomorrow. As a society, we spend very little money and attention and time and effort on the risks that are truly existential and that imperil our future. Very few people are actually thinking about those risks in systematic and cumulative ways. Society tends to neglect the future in favor of the present. Future people are utterly disenfranchised. They can't vote, they can't lobby, they can't run for public office. Politicians have very little immediate incentive in their short-term way of thinking to even think about these people. They can't tweet, they can't write articles, they can't march in the streets. The 50 trillion or so who will succeed us are and truly a fairly significant silent majority. We tend to think of holding the future in trust as an environmental issue, but I would encourage us to think beyond that, because it's not just a climate crisis challenge. There are questions of artificial intelligence, the unfolding dominant role of biotechnology, nuclear disarmament are some of the most obvious. So learning from the future is critically important. We live in a time when we can see catastrophes on the horizon, whether they're engineered viruses, whether they're AI-enabled totalitarianism, whether it is the depletion of the fertility of our soil, the poisoning of our air, the poisoning of our water that is due to pollution, and particularly because of climate change. And because the stakes are so high, it seems to me that these simple propositions lead us to the conclusion that improving the prospects for all future generations should be a top moral priority of our time. It's possible for us to make a big impact. positively affecting those lives. And if that's true, then it's incumbent on us to take this seriously. So what do we do? It seems to me that the best way to approach this is through the sense of community, as several of you have talked about already today, and as many of you practice in your daily lives. Communities can grow faster. Communities can have great impact. Dan's history of the path to getting the right to a healthy environment adopted by the General Assembly is instructive. And we have some of these communities already in place. One is the United Nations. We also have the faith community, a community whose values call for caring for the future. Why should we care about it? Because we are people of faith, of allegiance to belief systems which guide us to make the right choices in our actions and decisions. And we know that there is remarkable congruence, stunning harmony, if you will, among those systems. Kusimita and I and our editor, Tatiana Relevskaya, and dozens of others have produced a book in the past year or so called Faith for Action, which I'll put the link to. It's free, download it, which looks at those things which we hold in common, which are common among us. We believe, all of us from different faiths, that God's relationship with all creatures is for all generations. We believe in a duty of stewardship. It's like any other moral duty. It doesn't expire, but it continues over time. We have care and concern for our own children and grandchildren, and that's extended by implication to strangers and to future generations. And the love for humankind and for all creatures is not limited in time any more than it is to people that you have personally met. Community building efforts already exist in some diverse and disorganized ways. We have a community of scientists trying to understand the implications of climate change. We have a community of moral scholars, which are trying to consider the moral aspects of climate change. It would be great to see a community of policymakers who want to try to reduce these risks and focus on these risks. But right now, we have no forum for systematic collaboration. The number of serious scientists, philosophers, religious leaders, policymakers, citizens who are actively working on the systematic and cumulative anticipation of risk and opportunity is probably fewer than the number of people who are attending this symposium right now. So how do we make this happen? A practical solution. And some will question whether this is truly practical. I think it is. We start with the United Nations, and we start with repurposing the Trusteeship Council. And the Parliament and many others, the Secretary General, many of you have called for repurposing the Trusteeship Council of the United Nations to act as trustee for and in the best interests of future generations, especially with regard to the management of the global commons and public goods and public risks that are associated with this management of the commons. The purpose of this management and the guidance and advice which comes from it will be to preserve the right of self-determination for future generations and to prevent actions which would foreclose the exercise of that right. Under current law and governance, future generations are just as disenfranchised as the residents of territories held under the UN mandate at the time of the adoption of the Charter. And yet they will be affected by decisions and actions in which they have no agency. It should be the new and extended purpose of the Trusteeship Council to serve as an advocate for those future generations in all UN actions and decisions adopted under conventions and agreements ratified and across the agencies of the UN. The proposed new role for the trusteeship council has potential, immense potential to safeguard rights already recognized, especially the right to a human environment. And the campaign to bring this into existence will create a youth movement, the likes of which we have never seen. It will serve as a catalyst for research and thought that will reshape academia. It will raise questions which cannot be ignored by the stovepipe system of issues and concerns which dominates the United Nations. Think of climate change. Where's the right forum to address climate change? Is it the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COPs? Is it the Human Rights Council? Is it the ILO? You start looking at, and within that, does UNEP have the lead or does UNDP? We focus on this in such a disorganized way that it does not leverage the interests, and it keeps us from considering and focusing on the overall issues and the underlying forces which are dominating the future for us. It's about questions, not answers. The important thing for right now is to get the question right. Repurposing the trusteeship council will cause nations to create a capacity to participate in deriving answers to these overriding questions, and a problem-solving community which is committed to learning from and protecting the future. It's a long path. It's not going to be easy. Some will consider it naive to even think of changing the UN Charter and repurposing this. But if it's necessary, it is not naive. I hope we can all join together in this cause.
Thank you so much, David. And now we're going to move into the visioning roundtable. But for those of you that are online, not with us here in the sanctuary, I don't know if it's visible to you, and I don't know if this was by design or happenstance, but it was definitely by divine intervention. The first row in this sanctuary is empty. And I think that is a point, is by design? Okay, which I think is an awesome testimony to the idea of being in the back, responsible for the future. And the future is not a seat that we're sitting in, but we should be conscious of. Every meeting that takes place that I've been involved in across the road here at the United Nations building, whoever is in the front seat is driving the conversation and everybody else is in the back seat, be it the ambassadors, be it whoever is presenting. So I think that's a testimony to where we're going with the visioning statement. I ask our dear sister Beth Lisman to lead us in the visioning discussion. Visioning roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Safet. Appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. Yes, one would think perhaps that a visioning roundtable might be a round table, but that is not the setting that we've been given this morning. So we always work with what we have. So we're going to have what's called a revolving roundtable, where those of you who are on the list, I will call you up 5 at a time and ask you to sit in this beautiful unoccupied front row, so you can be ready to speak. And then when those 5 are done, I will call the next 5 folks up. Looks like we'll have 3 sets of 5 and then perhaps a set online as well. So it's going to be a very exciting hour as we spend our time today. And before we start, I just want to say a quick word about technology. And first of all, thank you, David, for that wonderful proposal about the reuse of the trusteeship council at the UN. It's very helpful. I also get inspired whenever I think of future generations by the book, How to Be a Good Ancestor. I forget the name of the author, but I highly recommend the book, How to Be a Good Ancestor, because it helps us think of the many ways we've been raised in short-termism and participate in that, oftentimes unknowingly and unwittingly. So a quick word about technology going forward, because really technology can be our friend. Some people are very upset and worried right now about artificial intelligence, which is a good point. It's a very good point. But if we use technology and use it well, it can truly be our friend. Case in point, those of you on this visioning roundtable or revolving roundtable have been given 2 minutes, which I know is a very, very, very short time to put forward your vision, not what you have done, not what you potentially are in the midst of doing, but your vision. So to keep it quick, after your 2 minutes, I'm going to use this technology of the smiley face that says, please wrap up now. And if you go much further than 2 minutes, I will stand up and use my technology of my embodiment to bump you off the stage and welcome the next person. So that being said, the first 5 people will be Deborah Boudreau, Sister Veronica Brand, Imam Safet, Maria Farah, and Allison Kelly. Could you all please come up to the front here? And Deborah, please come on up to the podium and we will start with you. The podium is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, my friends on the Zoom. It's been a great pleasure to learn all the specialists, subject matter expert today to share with us, to look into what is our future. Tzu Chi Buddhism, leads by our founder, Master Zheng Yan, in 1966. It's a very simple. From 1966, now it's 58 years. Every day, still practice the same things. The practice is every morning when you wake up, you're grateful that you can be still sitting here. You can have a capacity to breathe. You can have a capacity to enjoy your life. So as a Buddhist practitioners, we always remind ourselves how to cultivate and practice to have a healthy, a sustainable environment. Really, number one, respect our ancient practitioner, our tradition. Number two, treasure the moment we have in this generations. How should we treasure that? From the food, we know biodiversity is facing a lot of challenge, but how can we practice that to reserve, to protect our Mother Earth? So the food security and biodiversity is very simple. AI can remind us to go back to a frugal, simple life. How to make it simple is what we are practicing right now. From clothing, from food, clothing, how can we reduce our desire? How can we reduce our desire to cut down so-called material stuff? From housing, how can we put our energy and creation to put the trash we created into a living space or any other subject matter to sustain? From transportation, how can we walk rather than drive? And then through the walk exercise, walking bodhisattva path to build it up your own health. Buddhists invite everybody to become a doer, a goer, an activist, a facilitator, and also a governor, convener to bring all the interfaith together. Buddhists in actions, Buddhists in action, Tzu Chi Buddhism, here to invite everyone to join. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for being the brilliant role model I knew you would be. And also, when you come up, please introduce yourself, your organization, what your role is, if you would like to say that. Yes, okay. Next, we have Sister Veronica Brand.
Good morning to you all, in person and online. I represent the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary here as an NGO at the UN. Very briefly, 3 points. What do we need to do to really promote or see the right implemented? I think we need a huge shift in consciousness and conscience, so that what Pope Francis calls ecological conversion can take place. Everything is interconnected, and our care for the natural world, and defending human rights are integral aspects of our faith, not a nice to do afterwards, after we've done other things. I think of communities in Latin America, the See Judge Act, which I think relates very much to what my predecessor just said, whereby faith-based communities really interpret the signs of their time, their situation, and then move on to reflect on them in light of their scriptures, their sacred stories, and then act. Sharing the stories, I think of how the women, for example, in the Rio Doce Valley in Brazil, are coping with the effects of the terrible environmental crime collapse of the tailings dam in Mariana, how they have embroidered their sorrows, their losses, the destruction of their livelihoods, how by coming together in solidarity, in a movement of pilgrimage, remembering, praying, and resistance, working and calling for justice. I believe we need more of that. Recognizing, secondly, and sharing our responsibility for our common home. Seeing all around our world, our natural world, as God's gift to be shared with present and future generations. And climate as a common good. Pope Francis in Laudato Si speaks of counteracting the throwaway culture, how much we need to do to work towards a circular economy. It doesn't end with recycling. Thirdly, we need to strengthen the mechanisms of accountability, whereby we look at social sin, not just individual sin, but we name and acknowledge it, and we work on and advocate for the responsibilities of governments and corporations. And I know Maria will pick up on, we need to advocate for the legally binding treaty. Oh, I see a face on business and human rights. She will talk about it. But finally, using our finances, our investments to work for human rights and environmental justice. I believe we can do more together as we sometimes withdraw from those companies and sometimes use our shareholder responsibility and advocacy with Investor Advocates for Social Justice and the ICCR.
Gotta love way some people creep off while continuing their points. Thank you very much, Veronica. Next, Brother Imam Safed.
Thank you for all the presentations and presenters and my brothers and sisters who spoke more wisely and articulately than I'm going to be able to speak right now. 3 things come to mind. 1, Quranic verse in terms of visioning for the future. Habla min Allah wa habla min nas, or habla Allah wa habla nas. Very simply, the lifeline, if you will, the umbilical cord, which connects us to the divine, is conditioned and conditions the umbilical cord, which connects us to one another. So this is the idea of interrelationship. And one another are those that are here and those that are already within us, yet have not been brought forth into the world yet. because we are the sum total of those who came before us. And we are part of adding to that sum total for those who will come after us. This is genetically correct. This is philosophically correct. This is spiritually correct understanding. Second point, these conditions and conditioning takes the form in Islamic teachings in general of rights and responsibilities. There's a term in the Arabic language called hukuk. Hukuk Allah wa hukuk an-nas. So what emanates from this relationship of interconnection between the divine and human and all others, and the conditioning and the condition, what is that translates to in practice, practical theology, is the idea of rights and responsibilities. So the term in Arabic, hukuk, means rights, but it also means duties. So someone's right is someone else's duty to ensure that that right takes place. And so in order for us to move away from the rhetoric and the language, which is important, it is putting it into the work program. It is putting these rights into situations in which they are judicially supported, protected, honored. Because a right is a right, but unless it is transformed into a duty upon who is responsible to carry out that right, the giving, the granting, the protecting of that right, it will not have any value. So we need to work hard to this. And the last point is, before I get the sign, is regarding the future. There's a verse in the Quran that speaks of, and I'll say very quickly in Arabic, it's part of it. Very simply, all you who have faith, we are all peoples of faiths, of various traditions, all you who have faith, be conscious of God in all that you think, say, and do. This awareness, this consciousness of God and all the divine and all that you think, say, and do, and look to see what each and every one of you individually and collectively have set forth for your futures. And the scholars of old said the futures in this understanding means not only Judgment Day and what's to come, but it means everything along the way that will get you there, including the future generations. And be conscious of God, be conscious of the divine in all that you are doing with regard to this preparation, for God is full aware of what you do and will hold you accountable for it. We're facing an existential threat, as all of us know. In our tradition, in one of our wisdom traditions, and this is also shared in the Talmud, I'm told by my brothers and sisters from the Jewish faith, it says when you see the windstorm and the judgment day coming forth, it's happening in front of your eyes. The end is near. The end is coming. Repent, the end is near type of thing. At that moment, what do? You don't freak out. You don't even drop in prayer. You take a sapling that is in your hand and you plant the sapling in the ground, knowing full well that you may not benefit from that because it'll take years for that to grow, but maybe those who come after it will benefit. So that's the mindset which we need to, was mentioned before by some of my colleagues, we need to cultivate. And that I'm planting today, not for me. I'm not going to benefit for it, but for tomorrow. And who benefits from that tree? Everyone, everything, all of our fellow creatures, not just humans. Those whom we know, those who we don't know, those who belong to our faith tradition and those who belong to other faith traditions and no faith traditions. Everyone benefits from it. And there's a little saying associated with that statement of the prophet, plant the tree. And it continues in this format. It may be that God, the divine, out of mercy, will allow that tree to fully grow before the destruction comes in forth. So it may delay that coming of the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam Saqib. And thanks to each of you for turning off your cell phones if you happen to have electronic devices. Thank you again for assisting with this wonderful visioning revolving roundtable and sticking to your time. Next, we have Maria Farah from Franciscans International.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation and opportunity to speak here today. And I'm also thankful to follow up on Veronica's statement, and hopefully it'll make my statement be on time. Franciscans International constantly hears from our partners on the ground on the impacts that they and their communities face as a result of the environmental degradation and other human rights impacts caused by corporations. In the Solomon Islands, for example, logging has led to deteriorating water quality for home, as well as water quality in coastal areas, which has impacted fishing. These and other environmental impacts in the Solomon Islands come alongside other issues such as trafficking. I'm sure we're all here today could name a number of other instances where corporations have degraded the environment and violated human rights. I would also note that the impact of corporations has been addressed in the reports of the Special Rapporteur on Environment and Human Rights, including in his reports on the 6 elements which were mentioned, air quality, water, food, and others. I also note that in the last Human Rights Council session in March, the resolution that was passed in regards to the right to a healthy environment called for the organization of a seminar on business impacts on the environment, which should be held by the end of the year, and we'll hopefully have a report that will help guide us. And as another area which has been mentioned by the Special Rapporteur, and in particular, in regards to the resolutions, they specifically mentioned the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were passed in 2011. But shortly after the passing of the UN Guiding Principles in 2014, it was already clear, so only a couple years later, that these non-binding principles were really not enough to offer sufficient protection of human rights as well as protection of the environment. So there was an effort and a resolution passed at the Human Rights Council, which established an intergovernmental working group to work on a legally binding instruments to regulate transnational corporations under international human rights law, which Veronica had mentioned. So negotiations for this legally binding instrument have been ongoing, and there is currently a third revised draft, and we're expecting another draft by the end of July. Now, human rights abuses are defined to include abuses against the right to a healthy environment. And as Daniel mentioned in his first presentation, I think that this is a very important step. We need to have this recognition throughout different treaties and other instances. So as a passing note, since I'm out of time, I would really encourage everyone to get involved with the negotiations, even if it's just to encourage member states to actively participate and participate in good faith in Geneva. The US, unsurprisingly, has not been particularly helpful, I would say. In the past couple of years, they tried to actively obstruct the process, and now they're engaging, but they're not engaging in helpful ways. So those of us that are based here, I would particularly try to focus our advocacy towards the US. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Next, we have my dear friend Allison Kelly from ACT Alliance. The floor is yours.
Good morning. So I'm Allison Kelly. I'm the representative to the UN for ACT Alliance, and I'll speak out of our advocacy pillar in a sense. So as we mark World Environment Day, I'd first like to thank the organizing speakers of this timely event. We would certainly agree the simple importance of having the basic right to a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment cannot be understated. For ACT Alliance, as a faith and rights-based global alliance of some 140 humanitarian and development organizations working for transformational change and justice, the right to a healthy environment aligns with and complements our people-centered and community-led approach. So our vision to realize the right for a healthy environment requires, first off, fulfilling the call on member states in the recent Human Rights Council and UN General Assembly resolutions to enshrine the right to a healthy environment in national constitutions and regional treaties. That is, for the right to a healthy environment to be effectively implemented, it must be promoted by member states. But for all of us, it must serve as the rallying point to promote comprehensive and integrated solutions to the intersecting issues that the world faces. But it's also not a magic path. So our practical proposals to realize this right within what we can reasonably hope to deliver is to redouble our efforts in, first of all, supporting and demanding inclusive dialogues from local to global levels to discern the solutions that work for differing contexts, including, of course, faith voices, but with particular attention to Indigenous communities, women, youth and children, people with disabilities, and the displaced. Secondly, building our understanding of how the right to a healthy environment can work alongside other related rights to change prevailing narratives and to develop and implement the strong legal frameworks and regulations we need. And finally, and I think this echoes our speaker earlier, perhaps the biggest challenge to us all, we must intentionally and urgently reshape our siloed approaches and structures into truly multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder partnerships and systems that are fit for purpose to achieve the healthy and sustainable environment. Thank you.
Wonderful. That was a wonderful kickoff, wasn't it? Let's give our first 5 roundtable people another hand. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to call up our next 5 revolving table people to the front row, and that would be Bruce Knotts, Carl Morell, Alyssa Ng, are you here? Sue Ream, and Hiro Sakurai. And Bruce, I will turn the podium directly over to you.
Hello, my name is Bruce Knotts, and I represent the International Convocation of Unitarian Universalist Women. I also work on the NGO Committee on Human Rights and the NGO Committee on Disarmament, Peace, and Security. We are asked by my brother and friend, David Hales, to think about generations unborn. I'm a little bit worried that we care about the generations that we already have. And in my wonderful teachings that I received mostly from my Muslim brothers in Sudan, in Khartoum, and I think as I watch the TV, how Khartoum has been destroyed and people are suffering. And I remember the kind imams that sat and talked to me and said, if your neighbor is hungry, you don't eat your dinner. You make sure your neighbor has food before you eat your own dinner. It's that kind of compassion that we need to have for each other now before we can think of compassion for generations unborn. Also, Master Chen Yan of the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation, Deborah was absolutely right. It's reducing our desires for possessions and things today and increasing our compassion and doing more and more for other people. And I've learned very much from Master Chen Yan and the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation. And that is the example. We talk about waste and throwing things away. Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation doesn't throw anything away. They recycle everything. Everything they have, they recycle. And it is just wonderful how they repurpose everything like we want to repurpose a trusteeship council. So I hope we go away from this meeting today and think we're all in this together. And we really have to be in solidarity with everyone. And it's not just about generations unborn. We don't even care about the people in our own city that are suffering. We are people very close to us, nearby, within walking distance, that need our help, that we don't care about. So we need to increase our compassion, increase our service, and reduce our own desires for more and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for that blessedly brief and powerful intervention. Beautiful. Next, we'll hear from Carl Morell.
Thank you so much, Carl Morell, United States Baha'i Community, United Nations representative. Let the clock begin. I was at a national environmental conference, faith leaders, and what they shared was all of the injustices that they face. And they wondered, how can I think about climate when I'm facing this and that? And there are many injustices that accompany climate injustice, racial injustice, the poverty to undermine public health outcomes, to increase food insecurity. That such ills exist at a time of unparalleled global material prosperity is unconscionable. Moreover, when one considers that society can be conceived as an interdependent societal body, in which each individual and group derives its well-being from the well-being of the whole, the time has come for a substantive change. It's well past due. Correcting the longstanding ills stemming from injustice will demand a renewed focus on the foundational concept of justice itself in the broadest sense. It must be acknowledged that the instruments of society, individuals, communities, and institutions possess agency and room for advancement in establishing racial and climate justice. As individuals, justice will demand that we overlook self-interest for the betterment of all and view the world through the lens of equity. At the community and institutional level, justice will require a level of action that looks beyond society's current proclivity to negotiate and compromise, often settling on the least poor option instead of engaging in an ongoing principled, fact-based consultative process to arrive at the best possible outcome. Justice requires universal participation in creating and benefiting from shared prosperity. Further, it demands coherence between rhetoric and action. No longer can we allow well-meaning words to take the place of righteous deeds. Instead, the practice of true justice could serve as a building block of a trusting, interconnected society. To overcome these challenges, change is needed at multiple levels. First, the relationships that bind together various societal actors must be characterized by trust, mutual support, and cooperation. Collectively, society must recognize the essential dignity and latent potentiality of every single human soul, and act structural changes at the level of law and policy that seek to protect and empower current and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. Now, listening.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alyssa Ng from the Center for Earth Ethics, and I'm so happy to be here to discuss this very important issue. So the right to a healthy environment should be enshrined into law like it is as the New York State, the Green Amendment, where it can be used as a basis for stronger protection, especially for disadvantaged and marginalized communities that face threats from polluting facilities and the intensifying effects of climate change and biodiversity loss. Faith communities should stand and uplift these voices that emerge in these communities and urge governments to respond accordingly. The human right to a healthy environment is intertwined with nature's right to exist and thrive with and without us. When the state of nature declines, so does our health, the connection we have with our history and culture, and our connections with each other. What that means for us is we need to reduce emissions to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, eventually fully decarbonize, restore ecosystems, and invest in trust in the indigenous communities and local communities. We need to support international agreements, such as the Global Biodiversity Framework and the formation of the UNEA-Plastic Treaty to achieve this right. Faith communities and organizations have the unique ability to act as messengers of truth using moral reasoning and storytelling. When looking at the human right through a moral and spiritual lens, communities can instill and spread the importance of this right with a higher and deeper calling. Storytelling is a way for communities to feel, connect, and reflect on this topic. It cultivates a deeper understanding, and as it does, so the strong belief will change lives. On a more tangible scale, faith institutions can divest from companies and banks that invest heavily in fossil fuels, utilize renewable energy and sustainable goods when possible, use their buildings as inclusive green spaces for the community, and actively voice their concerns. There have been recent injustices, such as the restriction of power for environmental and indigenous ministries in Brazil, the streamlining of the Mountain Valley Pipeline in the debt ceiling deal, and the Supreme Court restricting the EPA's authority to regulate wetlands. When environmental and human prosperity are seen as obstacles to the prevailing value system of profit and economic growth, it is more important than ever to implement this right to the right to a healthy environment for us and for future generations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Next, I would like to welcome to the podium Sue Ream from Presbyterian Church USA.
Good morning. I'm going to read my remarks so that I can keep it within that 2-minute framework. This vision for a renewed and restored creation is daunting in its scope, but we know that God's abundance makes this transition possible. There is no doubt that transition to a low carbon, zero emissions economy will be difficult. Indeed, most people living today cannot imagine a society in which we have left behind fossil fuels, internal combustion engines, degradation of the environment for profit, poverty, and racism, but we believe that such a vision is possible. Environmental degradation and climate change cannot be addressed without also tackling the underpinning sins of racism, white supremacy, and economic injustice. And so we must engage in the hard work of dismantling white supremacy, starting within our own institutions. The work of anti-racism is a necessary foundation to the ongoing work of restoring creation to a right relationship. We believe that God is calling the church to the trifold work of environmental justice, racial justice, and economic justice. To those who would worry about how difficult this transformation will be or how expensive to achieve, we must lift up our vision. An environment renewed, better health outcomes, living wage jobs, clean air and water, wilderness preserved for its own sake, access to healthy food, and the reparation of broken relationships. We define eco-justice as the well-being of all humankind on thriving Earth. It provides the church a vision that all is interconnected and inclusive, so that our concept of justice is comprehensive and cannot be complete when one element, be it economic, racial, or social, environmental is missing. We must reiterate the goal of a green economy. It cannot be limited strictly to ecological concerns or environmental policy, but must address concerns of racial and economic justice in the marketplace, including a living wage, access to safe, affordable housing, healthcare, food, rigorous regulation of high polluting sectors and industries, programs to replace and retrofit aging buildings and infrastructure, access to jobs and job training in sustainable industries, and workforce development programs for workers who will transition from the fossil fuel industry to sectors with renewable and sustainable practices. We must recognize that economic justice is important, especially for women who bear the brunt of many climatic impacts. We must affirm the economic principle of sufficiency as a guiding factor in our economic decisions, as opposed to access, which currently guides the US economy and the economies of the developed countries. We believe that people are more important than profits and that God has provided abundance in creation. And in our sacred text in the book of Psalms, we have the image of a flourishing world in which the trees clap and the waves dance and people are flourishing. And that is the image and the vision that we hope to create for our people.
Thank you very much, Sue. Next, Hiro Sakurai.
Good morning. My name is Hiro Sakurai with Soka Gakkai International. So in response to the questions about vision and practical proposals to implement the right to a healthy environment, I would like to read several ideas. So actions at all levels are important for the implementation of the right to a healthy environment. At the national level, actions which can contribute to protecting and restoring biodiversity, promoting agroecology, reducing pollution, but also respecting and fulfilling the right to access information
public participation and access to justice, including for environmental, human rights defenders, indigenous peoples, and local communities. In the context of faith communities, work together with local communities to enable places of worship to restore biodiversity. Work on food waste, sourcing food sustainably, especially during religious events or gatherings, for instance. Speak up against the shrinking of public space, center the voices of indigenous peoples and environmental human rights defenders. And meaningful hands-on environmental education that enables young people to love their environment, that enables a sense of wonder, is also a key for the implementation of the right for the future. Faith communities can team up with partners and contribute through non-formal educational tools that empower people to take concrete action. At the international level, is to address the issue of plastic pollution and fossil fuels. For plastic pollution, we need a strong treaty that will address the full life cycle of plastics. For fossil fuels, we need a non-proliferation treaty. Endorse the Fossil Fuels on Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Advocate at the national level for a strong plastic pollution treaty ahead of the next round of negotiations. Thank you.
That was a great round. Thank you very much to our middle round of speakers. We'll call up our final round and you'll have 2 minutes each. That round will be Hannah Williams, Jimmy Walters, Deepika Singh, and Brother Ben Ioti, and Dr. Levi Bautista. Please come up to the front, and I'm going to turn it right over to you, Hannah. Please take the podium. You have 2 minutes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Hannah Williams from the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. I want to thank our speakers today for each of their talks discussing their visions of implementing the right to a healthy environment. They have articulated an important principle that underscores the relationship between rights and responsibility. This vision to the right to a healthy environment can only be effectively implemented if we as individuals and as a society take responsibility to protect that right, that we see protecting the environment as a horizon of human rights. As Reverend Mullen stated, we should be turning to our spiritual traditions and looking to our faith exemplars as a way to respond to these challenges. Within the Orthodox tradition, there is a practice with monastics to build an ascetic mindset. This mindset involves reorienting our mindset towards a spirit of cooperation with God's creatures. I'd like to quote his Beatitude Patriarch Ignatius of Antioch of the Antiochian Church in a statement where he underscores the interdependence that an ascetic mindset plays in the responsibility of Christians to care for the environment. Asceticism is indispensable if we are to achieve that limitation of desires, which will make it possible for us to respect better the earth and the life which belongs to it, and to bring into operation sharing on a planetary scale. Asceticism is also necessary as a basis for that profound sympathy with nature, which is often experienced by today's youth who have no other way toward the mysterious other than the beauty of the world. This sympathy may prove to be the last barrier remaining against barbarism and against the destruction of the animal and planet world. In closing, I want to leave you with this quote from Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew that encapsulates our responsibility to protect each other's right to a healthy environment. Our responsibility as stewards of creation is tied to our ontological relationship. None of us, he states, exists in isolation from the whole of humanity or from the totality of creation. We are dependent creatures, creatures ever in communion, and hence we are also morally responsible, not only for ourselves or for those whom immediately influence or affect, but for the whole of the created order, the whole city of the cosmos to speak. In our own time, especially, we must understand that serving our neighbor and preserving the natural environment are intimately and inseparably connected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next person, we will hear from Jimmy Walters.
Good morning, everyone. I represent the Sisters of Charity Federation. It really is a pleasure to be here and to be with so many inspiring speakers. Civil rights activist Ruby Sales poses a question in reaction to the internal and collective pain of humanity. First posed to a woman after a difficult night and we imagine even more challenging life, Ms. Sales asked her this question: where does it hurt? Note that she didn't ask what is wrong or what did you do? She asked, where does it hurt? My friends, as we gather this morning and explore, strategize, and pray for the right to a healthy environment for ourselves and for future generations, perhaps our starting point needs a shift. Perhaps we need to begin by exploring and embracing our woundedness. As people of faith, there is an urgent invitation before us to better step into and heal wounds and to inspire one another. We recognize our collectiveness, unity, and this call for transformation. And so this is my hopeful vision for the right to a healthy environment. Yes, practical strategies are important for replication and to uphold dignity for humanity and our planet. And yes, we may need to reimagine how we do what we do. But at the core of this work has to continue to be our heart. Yes, we are called to this difficult yet worthwhile work of being wounded healers. We must both individually and collectively heal the wounds that we have caused and the wounds we received. We must hold governments and those with great power accountable and expect and demand more from them. But first, we must hold one another accountable, especially ourselves. Our daily actions and behaviors, our commitment to prayer, and our willingness to listen and to learn are primary. In the words of 17th century Saint Vincent de Paul, we must allow our love to be inventive to infinity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jimmy. I also would like to note that we have 3 folks who are weighing in online. And so perhaps so Linnea can know to spotlight you, I will ask Lauren Van Ham, Reverend Scott Stearman, and Shafali Ajmera to please raise your hands, your virtual hands, so Linnea can get ready to spotlight you. So very grateful now to turn it over to Deepika Singh, Religions for Peace.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. First of all, allow me to express my deep appreciation to all the speakers for enlightening us with their expertise, experiences, and insight. Thank you so much. It's almost so befitting that this year on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a day after the World Environment Day, we're all meeting here together to have this very important discussion. One of the things is that we all know that there's a perception among some that religion and human rights are incompatible, even antagonistic, right? But that is not the case. Yes, it is true that religion can and is at times misused and manipulated to violate human rights. However, we also know that religion plays and will continue to play a very, very important role in protecting and promoting human rights, including the right to a healthy environment. So with having said that, it's very clear that, today, all rights are interconnected and interdependent. One affects and impacts another. Today, we are experiencing and witnessing untold suffering and devastating destruction due to the triple planetary crisis of that has been repeated often: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. However, with the right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment, the expectation and hope is that we are able to get this, have a wonderful and move towards a much more, it sort of catalyzes our raising of awareness, advocating, and taking actions on the ground, very concrete actions on the ground, hopefully spurring on and furthering momentum for a much more positive, transformative changes among and for the people and the planet. So what we need to do, I wanted to go into some of the examples, of very concrete examples, but then the time is short. So I'll just end it by sort of saying, what we need to do is, leverage our comparative advantages and strength, right? So we're able to, what we need, we need to work together to raise awareness among the people, advocate for, to eliminate regressive views and promote a positive behavior change. We need to lobby governments for laws and policies for promoting and protecting rights, and hold these governments accountable, for effectively implementing them as well. But we need to do, and we also need to make sure that we bring all the stakeholders together for regularly in order to take stock and share our lessons learned, and be able to ensure that we have resources to scale up, replicate successes. But we need to do that in order to succeed and realize this, right? We need to work together, and that's the most important, crucial thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. We realize we don't have the chapel forever, so we're going to wrap up with Brother Ben Yogi and then Dr. Levy Bautista.
Thank you. I was recently for my holidays in Kenya, and I told my mom, we had two important things. The Pope had said that we need to listen to the cry of the earth, listen to the cry of the poor. And she told me, tell the Kenyan government to listen, not us. That was one thing. And I knew what she meant. The other thing she told me, I told her, oh, the UN is so good. They brought this new law that everyone should have a right to healthy environments. She told me, tell the Ugandan government and the Tanzanian government to stop the EACOP, the East African Pipeline, crude oil pipeline. It's very practical, telling us that, if we really need to implement these, we need to stop this, what is happening in Africa. The investments in fossil fuels, the wars in Niger Delta in Nigeria, and even in the DRC Congo, the wars that are happening there. That is the practical way to go, to bring the transformation that we need to really make this work on the grassroots. Thank you.
Thank you for your blessedly brief intervention. We'll introduce Levy Bautista from Congo and then over to Shefali Ajmera online. And then we will hear concluding remarks from the Venerable Doyen Park.
Thank you, Beth. Good morning. Levy Bautista, representative of the United Methodist Church of the United Nations. Being delayed on the train has its curses and blessings. I was able to jot down notes for the thoughts I'd like to share with you. 5 quick things. Chief Shattle of the Duwami's and Suquami's Nation, and Makliing Dulag from the Igorot tribe in northern Philippines, and many other indigenous sages have said, the land will far outlive us. How dare we own the land? And I think that to me evokes the centrality of the theme of this event today. That's one that I'd like to share. Number two, this leads me to my next affirmation, that our understanding of human rights, the way the resolution or the statement is predicated, behooves us to abandon the large anthropocentrism of our understanding of human rights and embrace a far more planetary cosmology akin to indigenous peoples' affirmations. And I want to raise today, and I'd like to invite you, I hope I will get the date soon once it's there, a group of 58 as of today, special rapporteurs and independent mechanisms will be launching during the high-level political forum, the Maastricht Principles on the Human Rights of Future Generations. A realization that human rights experts are seeing in the current human rights regime, that the planetary aspect is far too muted and the anthropocentrism of human rights rather than planetary rights. That's number two. Number three, if our affirmation of human rights is just like what Kofi Annan said some time ago, that human rights are the protections we give to human dignity, that human rights are the sacred home in which human dignity feels secure in our human relations, then that sacred home is not just our soul, it's not just body and the spirit, but the entire cosmos. Again, a plea to a planetary understanding. You've heard me say this before, and I close it with my love for alliteration. If there is anything that connects humanity with the planet, it is our call for food and freedom, jobs and justice, land and liberation. It's an expression of our being and belonging, of our becoming, one with the oikoumene, the whole inhabited world, and one with cosmology. I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Levy. Appreciate that. And Shefali Ajmera online. Linnea, if you could please highlight Shefali.
Jai Jinendra, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I wish I could have been in person. It has been really an immense pleasure to hear all wonderful speakers. Wonderful points have been put forth, and I hope this today's meeting of ours is going to bring a tremendous impact on Earth and will make it help clean the way we are wanting it to be. So I am a coordinator of NRI Pramanik Pathshala. We run Jain Pathshala across the globe. We have kids from 3 years of age to 90 years of age people, and we teach them principles of Jainism. And the most important part of our teaching is that how to make it, bring it into practical life, as Jainism in itself is a way of life. Today, I'm going to be talking about three most important aspects of Jainism. Number one is ahimsa is the most important religion for us. Ahimsa paramo dharma means ahimsa, most of us understands it's non-violence, but it is just not limited to non-violence. Here, non-violence is incorporating all the virtues that are necessary for the earth to survive and the beings on the earth to live happily and peacefully and in harmony with each other. So it is a very vital virtue that has to be understood in the right sense that it is meant for. Another important principle of Jainism is live and let live, means each and every being on this earth, maybe be it a one sense organism or five sense organisms like us humans, all have equal rights of living. So if we really care for the rights of each and every being, this problem of climate change will not occur. As in Jainism, the nature is composed of one sense beings like water, plants, air, everything is one sense being. So now we as humans for our survival and other beings also for their survival has to consume one sense being organisms, but we cannot waste them. We cannot really make bad use of them, and we cannot do anything which brings their lives into atrocities. So the reactions will be negative always whenever this happens. So any being, which is being the most important point, another one is third principle is parasparograha jivana, means we are interdependent on each other. in our body form also, we see there are so many organisms that are within us and we depend on them for our survival. Similarly, in the nature also, we are dependent on all different life forms that we see. Maybe be it a termite, maybe it a rainforest tree, or maybe it any being on the earth. So any damage is caused to the life of that being, it impacts the human life and the nature in general. So the most important aspect of it is, I want to bring the attention towards, is non-killing world. So we are killing so many organisms in the form of insecticides, pesticides we use, the slaughterhouses, we are killing the animals. And it's not just like in the nature where there are so many carnivorous animals that live on other animals. Nature has its perfect balance. They know how to, those animals are meant for each other to be eaten and to be consumed. Like nature is made that way. As humans, we really do not need to do that kind of slaughtering and fishing, and immense amount of animals are being killed and we are not really even consuming them. So much of it is just going into waste. So if somehow we start living on plant-based life and start living on the on our, like in our whatever is produced in our neighborhood, we start living in locally produced foods, a lot of problems of the nature will be diminished. Unnecessary fuels and all those things will not be used, and only when something important which is really not being, which is a kind of urgent for humans to have, and it is not produced in their local areas, then we can really export it or import it from other nations or worldwide places. But for smaller things, for food needs and other things, it should be locally produced. Our bodies are meant that way to consume, to live with nature. And also like GMO products and all those things should not be really encouraged, because many life forms that depend on that particular kind of vegetation gets impacted, and the biomass gets impacted because of it. And then the whole nature suffers because of it. And ultimately everything comes onto the lives of the humans. So the key point I would like to stress again over here is non-killing world. I understand that it looks unnatural, but we can make it. We can do it if we.
Thank you,
really
Shefali.
listen to
Yes,
that.
thank you. You went way over the 2 minutes, but we.
Oh my God, I'm
appreciate
so
your
sorry.
perspective.
So sorry. So
Thank you
sorry.
for the Jane perspective. Now we only have, unfortunately, 2 minutes to offer to our closing speaker, Reverend Doyon Park, but I would like to note that she can continue the conversation afterwards, but there is an event coming in. Oh, and I'm getting the signal. Actually, we are at a hard stop right now. So we are going to thank you all for coming. There is a prayer service in here in the Episcopal Church. So thank you for your time. We'll continue the conversation outside. Thank you very much.
Yes, exactly. Yes. You're invited to lunch on the 5th floor. Can you hear me, everyone? Lunch on the 5th floor for those that are free.